It's time now for Global Insight, where we connect with people from around the world on issues making headlines. Recently, everything from toys, books and electronics to pharmaceuticals and semiconductors for cars, the global supply chain is in gridlock. According to RBC Capital, 77% of major world ports have experienced above average wait times this year. Growing demand for goods, logistical complications, not to mention a shortage of labour, have created the perfect storm for the supply chain crisis the world is currently in. And to gain insights on how long this is going to last and whether this means a rather disappointing shopping experience for shoppers on Black Friday and the holiday season, we're joined by Nick Vyas, Executive Director of USC Marshall Center for Global Supply Chain Management and Assistant Professor of Clinical Data Sciences and Operations, and Garth Frieson, Head of Portfolio of a US hedge fund, author and a member of the New York Federal Reserve Investor Advisory Committee. A very warm welcome to you both, and let's start with you, Professor Vyas. Now, how did the crisis reach this point? Would you say that the COVID-19 has been the biggest culprit?
Well, certainly, I think we can look at COVID as a catalyst, but if you were to look at the global supply chain as a whole, I think this is in making for the last 40 years. And what do I mean by last 40 years? Meaning, over the last 40 years, or 4 decades, we have actually created this long string of supply chain that is very one country or one region dependent. And COVID really exposed the structural deficiencies of our global supply chain network and created end-to-end disruption.
And now, Mr. Frieson, in Florida, it looks like governments are now stepping in to resolve this supply chain chaos that's taking place all around the world. Do you expect the current power shortage crisis in China to worsen the problem?
Yeah, well, I think the shortage of what you're seeing in China for electricity is really happening everywhere when it comes to the energy shortage. You're seeing natural gas prices triple in the United States, go up by a factor of 5 times in Europe. And of course, you see what's going on in China with coal prices. So what I think is happening is the shortage of demand, or the shortage of energy, is creating production slowdowns. And you're beginning to see that at the ports as well. For the first time in a while, you've seen a tapering off of the cost of shipping from China's ports to the U.S. West Coast. They peaked at up to $20,000 a container a few weeks ago, and you've started to see that come off to maybe $16,000 a container over the last couple of weeks. Some of that, I think, is related to the slowdown in production that's directly a result of the energy crisis that's going on everywhere, and the electricity shortage in China. Yeah, so it's definitely having an impact. And what it's doing is just creating another element of uncertainty, which is what these supply chains, the just-in-time methods require, is some level of certainty, and it's just adding another element of uncertainty to the supply chain.
Right, very uncertain times and more uncertain times ahead, it seems. And Professor Vyas, you did mention that this supply chain crisis, it was a long time coming. It was it didn't happen overnight. Obviously, it's been building up over the years and decades. But, well, recently, the deliveries have been abnormally slow. Raw material prices, they've been rising. So shipping costs. What kind of impact is this going to have in the long term on businesses everywhere?
Well, I think the reason I call this as a perfect storm, because if you think about the global supply chain, we have end-to-end disruption. So you have shortages of raw material, the transportation network in the front end, feeding into the manufacturing capacity, the labor shortages in the manufacturing side. So that's the front end of supply chain that's really constrained. Then we look at the middle part of our supply chain, which is the distribution and logistics and ocean carriers. You think about the capacity constraints, resource constraints, and then the price, both energy as well as the fuel. All of these things have really escalated in cost. And last but not the least, the last mile deliveries from port to the customer, it's all clogged up. We have vessels dwelling for over 8 days. So imagine 8 to 10 days just a vessel to dwell, and that has actually lengthened the lead time of the vessel from port of origin to the destination by close to 3.5 weeks. So it's tying up the equipment, chassis, containers, So we are dealing with the perfect storm, and I anticipate this to continue to last us into at least 6 to 12 months before it normalizes.
Mr. Frieson, shoppers are definitely eager to buy again, go out shopping again, but the problem is that the shelves are emptying, and it looks like, as you said earlier, things are set to look uncertain for the time being. Well, companies like Walmart and ports in the UK as well, they're going into 24-hour operations just to get the supply chain moving. But what kind of long-term solutions are needed beyond these immediate fixes?
Well, as you say, there's some immediate fixes that have to take place, and as you pointed out, governments are taking some steps to intervene, whether it's addressing the chip shortage, whether it is trying to go 24/7 with port operations, which is probably going to be more difficult to execute than it is just clearing up capacity at the ports, because as the professor mentioned, so you get everything off a ship, but then they still have to get onto trucks and through to the distribution channels and to warehouses, which are also experiencing capacity shortages. I think I've read a number somewhere that there's a shortage just in the US of roughly 50,000 truck drivers. And so it's not just an immediate fix. And as far as the consumer goes this year and with the holiday, there is a lot of demand still, and consumers have a lot of spending capacity. They have very strong balance sheets, and the demand is still there. And the question is whether they're going to be able to get the goods that they're looking for. So while shelves maybe not be empty coming into the holiday season, they're likely not to be as rich with varieties due to all these delays that are taking place.
And Mr. Frieson, then what does this mean for the consumer, especially ahead of this holiday season? Are they going to be a bit disappointed by this year's Black Friday and also, after Christmas shopping?
Well, I think everybody's always disappointed with Black Friday and holiday seasons in terms of getting what they want. But I think this year, yes, it's if there is the perfect storm, as was mentioned, for consumers, this is it in terms of being able to get what you want on select goods. And it's important to note, though, that not everything is in shortage. Certain things there's plenty of supply of, but others are very impossible to get. And a lot of that is related to different disruptions in different parts of the world, depending on where the supply is coming from. But one of the steps that these companies are taking in order to get goods on the shelves, like you mentioned Target and Walmart, these are companies that have their own built-in integrated supply chains. And Target, for example, rather than trying to rely on the container ports and the container ships, they announced last week that they're chartering their own vessels. So they're leasing a vessel and taking care of their own supply chain from a shipping perspective. And when you own your own vessel or lease your own vessel, you can divert away from the busiest congested ports on the West Coast and go into other ports. And when you have that integrated supply chain, your own trucking fleet, you have a little more flexibility of where to get your goods. So I think all the fear might be a little bit overdone when it comes to being able to have a horrible shopping season. I think it's going to be okay.
Well, that's reassuring for shoppers everywhere. And Professor Vyas, now not only have deliveries been slow, raw material prices, shipping costs, as mentioned before, they've been soaring, and but then also the United States is suffering from a labour shortage. Now, how long do you think the supply chain crisis is going to last, and how do you think the labour shortage is going to affect the course of recovery?
Yeah, so let me go back before I come to the labor shortages, just the previous comment that was made. I am not that optimistic. Yes, Walmart and Target, they do have their integrated supply chain, but it's a drop in a bucket in terms of the total supply chain volume that we're looking at. Year to date, we have a 22% increase in consumer spending. This is outside the food and entertainment, right? As mentioned, the consumer spending is strong and will continue to be strong through the peak season. My concern is the sales to inventory ratio, which is a number that we look at it. The pipeline is dry. Historically, we have about 52 to 55 days of inventory in the pipeline. We're now clicking at less than 30 days. So there isn't much in the pipeline, and whatever it's in the pipeline is already clogged up. So that's my prognosis about how I see the peak seasons will be very disappointing. Now, that being said, to answer your question about the labor shortages, that's also, we have tremendous stimulus money pumped in, close to $2.7 trillion in US. That has spiked the savings rate, that has spiked the discretionary spending balances, and the benefits were extended. As such, the labor participation has been very low. So we have so many jobs open in order for it to actually, distribution centers, transportation industries, all the supply chain activity that you need to deliver the peak season. I don't think we have enough labor participation, nor likely to be there for the peak season to deliver the season in a meaningful way. So that crisis will probably carry through the peak season into the early next year.
Mr. Frieson, in recent weeks, we've seen reports, headlines asking whether the global supply chain is broken, whether things will be the same again. And it seems like there are going to be some significant changes in terms of rebuilding this global supply chain. And, well, do you think that this current crisis that we're in, it marks the end of what you called earlier the just-in-time model for logistics?
Yeah, I don't know if it marks the end to just-in-time. It certainly is going to mark a change in the way that it operates. For example, reshoring as opposed to offshoring. A lot of companies are talking about going to a more regional supply chain as opposed to a global supply chain. It was interesting. A study was released by NTT Data last month. Talking about not just my view, but companies that are operating in this supply chain, and 70% of them said that they felt that the supply chain has become too global. And so what that means is, a lot of different elements of deploying more technology with 5G rolling out to have a better visibility along the supply chain so people can identify when a shortage is beginning to develop or a delay is beginning to develop and diverge, as well as bringing manufacturing a little bit closer to the final demand. In the United States, for example, a lot of people are now talking about an increase in production in Mexico, for example.
And well, it looks like the supply chain issue is becoming more political as well. Professor Vyas, now reducing reliance on China is the Joe Biden administration's priority right now. How is this going to affect the way that global supply chains are built back?
So, I've written substantially about this topic and what I call the decouplings of supply chain without deglobalization. So what do I mean by decouplings? I think the regional customer-centric supply chain nodes, that they're independent within each region, but interdependent and create much more resiliency. So I think the idea that you see now, the governments across, not only in the US, but the Europe and other democracies are looking at their supply chain as a sort of a national interest to make sure that in the future, any future pandemic or geopolitical tensions do not disrupt the supply chains like it did under the COVID. So I think there will be a tremendous focus on decouplings of supply chain, number one. Number two, I think the government will have to play a critical role in a public-private partnership to support companies to either nearshore or onshore by providing a robust infrastructure. So in the US, we're looking at $3.5 trillion bill, and I think it needs to be politically supported on both sides of the aisle to make sure the companies will not come close to the shore unless they have a robust digital as well as physical infrastructure available for them. So I think these are the conditions of future of supply chain post-COVID, which will be decoupled. But I think the globalizations will continue to stay in place because we need the global market to sustain the growth that we have created over the last 40 years.
Well, I'm afraid that's all we have time for today. That was Nick Vyas and Garth Frieson. Thank you both so much for your time.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me.